Welcome to Marwen was released in 2018 and was directed by Robert Zemeckis and stars Steve Carell, Leslie Mann, Diane Kruger, Merritt Weaver, and Janelle Monáe, and is inspired by the true story of Mark Hogancamp, who is a victim of a brutal attack and finds a unique and beautiful therapeutic outlet to help him through his recovery process. I've been intrigued by this film ever since the trailer for it was released, and even more so after the terrible reception it received upon its release. And I knew one day I would eventually have to sit down and watch it and judge it for myself. You might be asking yourself why I've decided to review this movie of all things. Well, for one, I've been reviewing a lot of movies I would call quote-unquote good movies and movies I absolutely love, and I've really been in the need for something different and something much more challenging to talk about. So why not talk about something from the exact opposite side of the spectrum? Ever since rebranding this channel, I've wanted to focus on promoting film positivity, and I realize that doesn't just mean I'm only going to review nothing but good movies. That also means looking at the good and the bad in film, but having a positive outlook. Now, I know it's not always possible to be completely positive. When you find a movie that's absolute trash, it's much harder to say anything good about it. But there is a way you can talk about films and not be so mean-spirited about it, which I think has become lost here on YouTube, where there's so much angry negativity towards things that don't really deserve that much hateful energy. So you're going to see me talk about more films that might not necessarily be all that great, but I'm going to continue to tackle them the way I always have and still be respectful of this art form I love so much. One last note before we get started though, I've decided for certain movies I'll forego the typical behind the scenes section I typically have at the start of my reviews, and this mostly comes down to the information that's out there on a particular film, and perhaps eventually I might even get rid of the section altogether and integrate it more naturally into the review itself. As for this film we're talking about, there's really not too much I was able to find on it, and a lot of that is due to how new it is and the amount of attention it has been given. There's just not a whole lot out there. So, with that said, let's get into my thoughts on the film. Welcome to Marwen declares itself as a story inspired by true events, and I will use the word inspired loosely, although for the most part, from what I've been able to gather about the true story of Mark Hogancamp, the setup for his life is for the most part taken directly from the horrific events that transpired on April 8th, 2000, when Hogancamp was attacked outside a bar by 5 men who beat him nearly to death after he drunkenly told them he was a cross-dresser. The traumatic event left him with severe brain damage to the point he nearly remembered nothing from his previous life. After he was unable to afford therapy, Hogancamp took matters into his own hands and built a World War II-era Belgian town in his yard and populated it with dolls that represented himself, his friends, and his attackers. Since then, Hogancamp has become renowned for his art pieces and photography of his small community, and has used it as a way to get past the traumatic event that changed his life forever. Hogancamp's real-life story is a deeply compelling one that has already been documented in the documentary film Marwen, which, at the time of this review, I have failed to see. But his story is an extremely impactful one worthy of being told and shared with everyone. And I'm certain that film gets across his story far better than the film we'll be discussing, which takes this real man's story and Hollywoodizes it in ways that twist the story and in the end feels a bit irresponsible, which is what it was criticized for upon its release. But to understand the film, we need to perhaps look at the man that's responsible for putting it all together, the man himself, Robert Zemeckis. Zemeckis has had a very odd career. He's one of the most beloved Hollywood directors of all time. His name is often put up there beside names like Steven Spielberg and Francis Ford Coppola. And in his early career, he gave us such iconic films such as the Back to the Future trilogy, Who Framed Roger Rabbit, Forrest Gump, and Castaway. Many of these films are considered some of the greatest films of all time. So, what happened? Well, Zemeckis has always been an innovator of technology, always pushing the bar in different ways, and we can see this even in his earlier films, especially with Who Framed Roger Rabbit, a film that integrates live action and animation into one of the most seamless movie experiences ever. Movies like Forrest Gump would go on to use effects in a new way by putting our fictional characters directly in the center of historical footage. And then he went through his most dramatic change ever in the 2000s with the release of The Polar Express, an animated film performed by a single actor, motion captured with some of the most hauntingly uncanny valley imagery ever put to screen. And he did this 2 more times with Beowulf and A Christmas Carol. All films received mostly mixed reception and minimal box office returns. The man responsible for pushing the envelope in terms of what could be done with film was at a standstill and moved back to doing more traditional films for a time. And then here comes Welcome to Marwen, which is the natural evolution of what he was trying to do with those previous animation efforts. The man just doesn't know when to quit. Now we come to this film, which tries yet again to push special effects in a new way, and it gives Zemeckis another chance to play with some new toys, and I think this is where the first major problem of Welcome to Marwen lies. The film's true story is in conflict with the dazzling special effects. Regardless of how one feels about any of Zemeckis' animation work, starting with Polar Express, there's no doubt the work that's gone into it is impressive. Yes, it can be a little weird watching these characters that look so photorealistic move around and talk, and the uncanny valley of it all is hard to ignore. But it's still cool to see. There's a lot of artistry here, and no doubt a lot of time and effort went into its making. I was in awe watching the photorealistic dolls walking around in this movie. The articulation, the way they move, it's all incredibly well crafted. Still a little uncanny valley, especially when we start looking at the faces that are so lifelike and porcelain that they end up looking too much like the real actors. Regardless, in terms of effects, and regardless of how you feel about the creepy factor of them, I think they do shine, but that's only one part of the movie, and sadly it feels like that was the biggest draw of this film for Zemeckis, because the rest of the film falls flat and lacks the attention given to Zemeckis' toys. The rest of the film is your typical dramatic fare that lacks any of the attention given to its special effects scenes and feels like a story designed around those scenes in mind. Welcome to Marwen is not concerned with telling the story of Mark Hogenkamp. Its concern is on the world of Marwen and how cool it would be to visually watch something in that environment. And I think to tell this story, that's not inherently a bad idea in concept. After all, the real Mark Hogenkamp used Marwen as a way to provide therapy to himself when those funds ran out. And so when that is done visually for a film, it should serve the same purpose. I think where this concept falls off the rails, though, is completely down to its execution. Zemeckis and his screenwriter, Carell Thompson, use the Marwen sequences as a way to express Hogenkamp's inner turmoil. But this fictional story in an already fictionalized version of real events becomes more focused on spectacle than giving the character any kind of catharsis. It tries to put it in there with the doll stand-in for Hogenkamp, Captain Hoagie, fighting his demons, which are his very real attackers in the form of Nazis, and the film uses this as a metaphorical representation of his own healing process. In Marwen, the Nazis can be killed, but they always come back. In the real world, Hogenkamp tries to move on from the events that changed his life forever, but the PTSD and those traumatic, life-altering moments always come back. This idea, I think, is worthy of being shown visually on screen, but the film instead takes it one step too far by adding these elements of an antagonist, a witch played by Diane Kruger, who is the real culprit of Hogenkamp's pain. It's clumsily handled, and that's how a majority of the film's most effective meditations on healing are dealt with, clumsily. The film seems to point to Marwen as a cure-all for Hogenkamp's pain, and if he accepts the events, then he can be set free. This works for a typical story when set in a fictional world where the main character triumphs over their problems and succeeds in the end. But Welcome to Marwen is inspired by a true story, even taking the real-life person's name, and as we know, life is never that simple, and the film treats it as a single cure-all method to make things right, and it ends up giving me an icky feeling. But it's not just the Marwen scenes that do this, it's most of the movie. Hogenkamp is a quiet, awkward, and closed-off protagonist from the start. Right from the start, we already empathize with his situation, and the movie will try anything to tear him down, such as introducing a female love interest into the film that helps Hogenkamp express his pain and help him in his recovery. Nicole, the love interest, played by Leslie Mann, takes an interest in Hogenkamp's story and befriends him, while Hogenkamp himself begins falling for her as a crutch for his pain. Nicole did not exist in real life, and there was a neighbor named Colleen, from which the name of the real-life Marwen was named after, Marwen Cole. But from what I can find, there is no correlation between the two. Nicole is an invention of the film that serves the purpose of building our protagonist up, only for it to all be torn down once she rejects his romantic advances, which provide us with the film's low point that sets up the final act of the film, which is a CGI action extravaganza far from the quiet and meditative real-life story of Mark Hogenkamp. Misguided is the term I would use to describe Welcome to Marwen. I don't believe for a second there was any ill intent in its making, but the way Zemeckis and Thompson decided to explore the film's themes feels like a terrible mix of ideals and two conflicting stories being told. One is a drama about a man dealing with a life-altering event and the means by which he copes with that, and the other is a fantasy tale and provides an answer to his pain. The film wraps up in a nice little bow in the style of a big Hollywood feel-good film, but in doing so it loses the intention and meaning behind the story it's actually trying to tell. The real moment for me that cemented why this film doesn't work in the way its filmmaker intended comes near the midpoint of the film, where Hogenkamp faces his attackers in court and has an episode which is visually shown to us through a panic episode where the characters of Marwen infiltrate the courtroom and open fire on an unsuspecting crowd. It feels tonally out of place with the film, and that's where part of the problems lie with how Marwen is represented in the film. It's so tonally different from the film's live-action moments that when it starts to invade the real world, it's more goofy than anything, which is why we, the audience, get mixed signals from watching this. How is this supposed to make us feel? And I don't know if the filmmakers can provide an answer to that. The term Oscar bait gets thrown around a lot with these kinds of films, and it's often pointed towards movies that are simply trying to manipulate you. I feel there is some truth to this, but in a way, all films have some form of manipulation through story elements and especially through music. The real question is if the manipulation feels earned, and Welcome to Marwen doesn't earn its emotional moments. The music, done by Alan Silvestri, a veteran composer of Zemeckis' films, fills the movie with a melancholic score that's reminiscent of themes found in other Zemeckis films, most importantly, Forrest Gump. A film that is overly sentimental, yet beloved by the majority of the public. Welcome to Marwen treats itself with the same sentimentality present in Forrest Gump, but with little of the heart that makes that film flawed, but still an engaging and likable experience. Welcome to Marwen is not a likable film and irresponsibly tells an incredible true story with no doubt the best of intentions in mind, but fails its subject matter through misguided attempts at drama and tonal shifts that make for a very messy film. There's also moments in the film that provide us with hints of narrative threads that could have been explored, but are sitting there ready to be explored, but are left unexplored. One such moment was Hogenkamp's fascination with high heels. In the true story, Hogenkamp was beaten after telling his attackers that he liked to cross-dress. Hogenkamp's story is therefore a hate crime by nature. The film does bring a variation of this up that Hogenkamp likes to at least wear women's high heels. It strips down the cross-dressing element, no doubt in a way to satisfy a more general audience that might not be prepared for a story of a man who is attacked for cross-dressing. The film brings up the hate crime angle, and the film could have very well used that as a jumping off point for a wider conversation. But instead, the focus is on the fantastical element of Hogenkamp's real story and fails the real man in this regard. If this was a hate crime, then let's explore that more fully because that's a jumping off point to tell the story. But they simply use it as a footnote to tell a story about recovery that sends mixed messages on how to achieve that. The film does this by saying the main character needs to stop taking his meds to achieve peace, and I find this line of thought dangerous and confused. The film does have a bright spot, though. Underneath all the narrative problems, mixed messaging, tonal shifts, and fumbling of its true story, there is Steve Carell at the film's center, and his performance is very good. We often see Carell as a comedic actor. He's been forever immortalized as Michael Scott. But we tend to forget Carell can be a very good dramatic actor as well. And I think he provides the film with a main character worth rooting for, and he is instantly sympathetic. And it's clear he took the material seriously, and he shines in the role. The movie might be a train wreck, but Steve Carell, and for the most part, the performances are not one of the film's weaknesses. The majority of the movie's problems come from its script and choices on what to focus on. Welcome to Marwen reminds me a lot of a similar true story film that was also heavily fictionalized and focused on all the wrong moments of its true story. Patch Adams. A film that provided mixed messages on its subject matter, but with a truly great central performance. Welcome to Marwen is Robert Zemeckis' Patch Adams, and I wonder if anyone has made that connection since its release, but it feels rather obvious when putting the films side by side. When I went into this movie, I wanted to be wrong. I don't always agree with the majority of critics, but in many instances, I still do. I hoped I would watch this movie and find a movie that was flawed, but at least pretty okay. And when the movie started, I felt that way. And by the time the movie ended, I was completely against it. Welcome to Marwen is a bad movie, but it's not without moments that shine. Steve Carell is very good in the film. The effects with the town of Marwen are really cool to see from a visual standpoint, and the ideas aren't all bad, just misguided in its execution and irresponsibly told. And with all that said, I'm going to give Welcome to Marwen a 4 out of 10. I wanted to be wrong about this one, but it just has so many problems that hold it back from being a film worthy of its subject. but it's made me even more interested in visiting the documentary about the real Mark Hogancamp, because I find his story to be utterly fascinating and even a story worth telling. But I think this film failed to honor that and focused instead on all the wrong aspects. Welcome to Marwen isn't good, and though this channel is mostly about spreading positivity and film criticism, I think it's still worth looking at films that aren't that good, but also dig into why in a way that's not angry and respectful, and even looking at some of the good that might be there, because Welcome to Marwen does have some good that is worth talking about, and I think that's lost when we only view something negatively. This isn't the case for every film. I wholly believe there are some films out there, films I've even reviewed in my first few years on YouTube, that are just not good films. But I still think there's a more positive way of looking at these films while also tearing into them if need be. And that's that. Thank you all, as always, for watching this review. I hope you enjoyed looking into some of my insights on this film. But as always, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel, and stay positive.